Welcome to Second Take, the show that takes a look at the issues behind the news. The public hearings into Eskom's next round of tariff increases kicked off this week. Terence Creamer joins me to discuss some of the initial highlights. Terence, in brief, what is Eskom requesting in its latest application?
Well, the headline is 16 times 5, so 16% tariff increases over a 5-year period, starting on April 1 this year, all the way through to 2018. But really what Eskom applies for, it's a methodology that the regulator looks at, is really an allowable revenue for the 5-year period. So they're looking at an allowable revenue in total over the period of 1.1 trillion rand. And that's broken up in a number of components. So big ticket items within that are things like primary energy, coal, which takes up a good 600 billion of that trillion. And then you've got other elements like operating costs, a return, depreciation, and that brings the big figure of 1.1 trillion at the end of the day, which then NERSA works back to a tariff. Well, in Eskom's calculation, that should be 16% every year for the next 5 years. And obviously, you know, they're saying that that's what's necessary for them to sustain their operations, their aging plants, to procure the coal they need to run their coal-fired power stations, as well as to, you know, build the next round of capacity up to the end of Kusile. So they're not looking at any projects beyond the Kusile power station, which comes on around 2018, 2019. And they're saying there will be some preparation work for some of these other projects, assuming that they, in terms of what the policy currently says, they'll build 65% of the integrated resource plan up to 2013. So they're saying they're not budgeting for it. In fact, if they were, they said they would require 20 times 5 and then another 5 years of 9% to, you know, cover the costs of what's in the integrated resource plan. So they've put a time horizon of the 2018. They've extended it from the traditional 3 years to 5 years. They're saying they need that certainty. And their aim is to, they say, keep the lights on, as well as to get to a standalone creditworthy rating by the end of that 5-year period. At the moment, it's very heavily dependent on the South African government as shareholder providing guarantees, and those guarantees have been substantial, so that Eskom can go about raising the debt it needs to fund. They've got about another 330 billion rands worth of capex to fund over the next 5-year period.
What are some of the issues the NERSA panel has heard this week?
Well, obviously there's a big pushback against 16 times 5. We already had tariffs that have increased around 200% since 2007. We started with a tariff of around 21 cents in 2007, and we've had these surging increases as we realized that, you know, we did realize that Eskom had a tariff that was too low for too long, but we've had to compensate massively as consumers to try and get them into some sort of creditworthy position, or in a position that they can keep operating and raise the debt for the big capital program. So we've had massive increases. We're currently sitting with a price of around 61 cents a kilowatt hour. That's not what you and I pay. We pay a lot more because we sit behind municipalities that then charge additional fees on top of that. And then so there are very few people that will get that, and even sort of industrial customers might be getting that sort of rate. So we're already paying a lot more than that. But that's the Eskom average tariff. And by the end of the period that they're looking at, Eskom saying the nominal tariff will rise from that 61 cents level to 128 cents. So we're looking at another more than doubling of the tariff over that 5-year period. So it's a sharp increase. It's one that businesses across the board are saying we can't tolerate. We're already at a tipping point in terms of being competitive. We've got consumers pushing back very strongly. We've got labour unions saying that this is an intolerable situation because jobs are at risk, because these businesses are now at risk. So we've got a lot of negative objection to Eskom. But the two issues, if you look at the methodology that have really been the focus of attention so far, have been the depreciation, which is and the way Eskom values its assets in this methodology, and then even more so around the rate of return that Eskom's looking at. So currently Eskom's wanting to take that rate of return from around less than 1% in 2013, all the way up to 7.8% by the end of the period. And that would account for 17% of the increase. And the figure is around 187 billion of that trillion rand that I spoke is just for the return. Now, most of that would be used to cover interest payments, but there is a portion that would go to in the form of equity repayment to the shareholder, around 46 billion, which I think some people are swallowing hard to accept. Does the government really need that sort of return? And generally, should Eskom as a utility, as a state-owned utility, be looking for a return at that level? Many are arguing that a 4% type return level is much more appropriate for a utility with the low-risk profile that Eskom has. Eskom's saying, but if you look at its business and the way it's operated in the last few years and its profit performance, it hasn't been a risk-free business, and it's actually been quite a difficult business. And this is the sort of return that it needs to get to that standalone credit rating. So there have been a lot of questions. Should Eskom be asking for such a return? What is the government view on this sort of return? Are they going to be demanding an equity return on this? That seems to be somewhat unclear. Does government really want dividends from Eskom? That seems to be somewhat unclear. So there's quite a few areas that the NERSA panel is asking, as well as the public, when they're looking at purely that allowable revenue equation. But of course, that's only a small portion of the hearings.
A number of policy issues have also been raised. Can NERSA do anything about that?
NERSA sits there in a very constrained position. They've got that methodology. They are negotiating the methodology, but that methodology is also based on electricity pricing policy that's backed itself by legislation. So they sit there with a fairly tight brief. Now, people that go and present to NERSA don't have a tight brief at all, so they raise all sorts of things. In fact, as I sort of alluded to in the last question, the bulk of the hearings are not taken up about the allowable revenue at all. So there's the focus on the returns, there's a focus on Eskom's operating costs, and are they under control, and those are within the ambit of NERSA. But on the whole, people focus on policy at these hearings, and I think the main reason they do so is there's no other platform really open to them to raise their policy concerns. So there's all sorts of policy matters coming up about whether the electricity pricing policy is correct, why there's questions about why we haven't reviewed the integrated resource plan already, because it is very much outdated. A lot of the things, the 2030 plan or the 2010 to 2030 plan, a lot of those elements are being questioned. We've got a lot lower demand growth than was forecast in the plan. So Eskom in its application is looking at 1.9%. The RRP was I think was closer to 2.5%. So there's a lot of lack of alignment between the RRP and the application. And then there's all sorts of things about whether some of these areas should be, subsidised out of the electricity tariff, or whether the electricity tariff is the right place to subsidise poor people, subsidise renewable energy, or whether it should come out of the fiscus. So there's a lot of policy elements, and these take up, I'd say, 60 to 80% of the NERSA panel's time. They sit there, they're interested, they express interest, they ask questions, but in fact their hands are very much tied, and they are very tightly constrained in their brief. Luckily for them, it's a tightly constrained brief. But my view is people have given a lot of thought, whether it's the labour unions, whether it's civil society, whether it's engineers, whether it's councils and municipalities. They've given thought to this electricity thing because it has become a very sort of pressing issue for all our lives. And there's no place for them to express these pressing issues, and they're using the NERSA platform. I think the DOE, it's incumbent on them to go out and to have an engagement with citizens around these very important policy matters, so that when we start reviewing the RRP, and that's supposed to take place this year, we have a lot more consultation, a lot more input, and I think they'll be surprised at the level of serious thought that has gone into this, from gender activist groups, religious groups, through to labour unions, through to academics, through to engineers. People are thinking about this matter, and we should listen to them.
Thank you. That's the Second Take show for this week. Thank you for watching, and join us again next time for more news analysis.